The situation between the United States and France in recent days has become one of the clearest symptoms of the deep crisis affecting the entire Western alliance, and the conflict between Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron has long ceased to be a personal misunderstanding or diplomatic awkwardness. What happened against the backdrop of the Davos speeches and subsequent statements from both sides is increasingly perceived as an open demonstration of the split within Western leadership. According to sources close to European diplomatic circles, the tension had been building for months, but it is only now that it has erupted into the public sphere, where every word and gesture carries strategic significance. Donald Trump, speaking before an international audience, took steps that in France and several other European capitals were perceived as a direct humiliation of an ally. The publication and retelling of private correspondence with Macron was, in essence, a violation of the unwritten rules of diplomacy, where even sharp disagreements are normally kept behind closed doors. For Paris, this became a signal that the White House no longer regards allies as equal partners, but uses public pressure as a tool of political coercion. Additional irritants included mockery and harsh phrasing, which the French press described as demonstrative disregard. However, beneath the external form lies a much more serious substance. The basis of the conflict is not rhetoric but policy. The trade threats voiced by Trump, particularly the idea of imposing extremely high tariffs on French products, primarily wine and champagne, were perceived in Paris as an attempt at direct economic blackmail. French authorities made it clear that such an approach is unacceptable and undermines the very concept of alliance. In response, Macron took a firm and principled position, emphasizing that France will not change its foreign policy under the pressure of tariffs and threats. According to sources, at this point, the conflict finally ceased to be behind the scenes. It became a symbol of a broader problem, the crisis of trust between the United States and Europe. In this confrontation, France acts not only on its own behalf but also as one of the voices of Europe, tired of the unpredictability of American policy. The situation around Greenland, tariff threats to allies, abrupt unilateral decisions, all of this created the impression that Washington is no longer bound by previous commitments. For Macron, this became a reason to speak openly about a world where international law and agreements yield to force and impulsive decisions. A separate episode of the conflict was France's public refutation of Trump's statements about French domestic politics and economy, which Paris called inaccurate. This step became a rare case in which a U.S. ally directly accuses the American president of spreading false information. Diplomatically, this is an extremely serious signal. It shows that the level of trust between the parties has fallen to a minimum. At the same time, it is important to understand that neither Paris nor Washington is formally interested in breaking off relations. France remains a key NATO member, the United States, Europe's main military partner. However, beneath the surface of stability, a new reality is increasingly emerging. The alliance is no longer unconditional. According to insiders, European capitals are increasingly discussing scenarios in which the United States may act against the interests of its allies, and therefore Europe must be prepared to make independent decisions. The conflict between Trump and Macron has become a litmus test for these processes. It has shown that even the largest Western countries can find themselves on opposite sides of the barricades on issues of trade, sovereignty, and the global order. In Washington, many perceive France's firm stance as a challenge to American leadership. In Trump's circle, there are assessments that Macron is trying to position himself as an alternative center of power in Europe and to speak to the United States on equal terms, which to the current administration appears unacceptable. It is here that the conflict acquires a strategic dimension. This is not a dispute over tariffs or protocol, but a struggle over who sets the rules within the Western world. Analysts note that such confrontation objectively plays into the hands of external players, primarily China and Russia, who are closely watching the split and using it to their advantage. Every public conflict between the United States and France undermines the image of the West as a unified bloc and facilitates the advancement of alternative centers of power. In this context, the events between Trump and Macron are seen as part of a broader transformation of the global order. France increasingly speaks of Europe's strategic autonomy and the need to reduce dependence on the United States in military, economic, and technological spheres. The United States, represented by Trump, demonstrates an approach in which allies must either comply or face pressure. These two logics are incompatible, which is why the conflict takes on a protracted character. Even if rhetoric softens in the near future, the structural causes of tension will not disappear. European analytical reports emphasize that the current crisis has become a turning point after which the previous format of transatlantic relations will no longer return. France will likely continue to defend a more independent line, while the United States will test the limits of allies' patience. As a result, we are witnessing not just a quarrel between two leaders, but a clash of two visions for the future of the West. One path leads to centralized, rigid U.S. leadership, the other to a more distributed system in which Europe claims an independent role. Which of these scenarios will prevail remains unclear, but it is already evident that the conflict between Macron and Trump has become a symbol of an era in which even the strongest alliances are no longer protected from internal fractures. This makes the current situation one of the most dangerous and telling in decades because it calls into question not only relations between the two countries, but the very architecture of the Western world, which for a long time seemed unshakable. Against this backdrop, European circles increasingly emphasize that the conflict between Paris and Washington has become a kind of test of the limits of what is permissible within the alliance, and simultaneously, a signal to other capitals. Many are closely watching whether France can maintain a firm line without facing serious consequences, because this will determine the willingness of other countries to act as independently. According to sources, Berlin, Rome, and Madrid are already concluding that the era when disagreements with the United States were automatically smoothed over is over, and now every crisis requires a demonstration of political will. Washington understands this as well, which is why current rhetoric increasingly resembles an attempt to maintain control through pressure rather than consensus. Experts note that if such conflicts continue to recur, they will gradually change the very culture of interaction within the West, transforming the alliance from a community of partners into a space of constant bargaining and power arguments. In this sense, the dispute between Trump and Macron may enter history not as an episode of personal enmity, but as the moment when it became finally clear that the previous model of transatlantic relations has exhausted itself and entered a phase of deep and irreversible reassessment. For the United States, the situation with France has become a troubling indicator. Pressure that once worked flawlessly now increasingly produces the opposite effect: consolidation and a push for autonomy. And the harsher the rhetoric, the faster allies begin seeking ways to reduce vulnerability. This is the main paradox of the current crisis. An attempt to maintain leadership through force accelerates the processes that erode that leadership.